All right, so when we talk about our Bible, we need to lay down a few ground terms first. So the Old Testament originals, when we talk about the Old Testament, the originals, those were written from around 1500 to 400 BC. All right, so over here, and you're welcome to look at if you want to come up here and look at this, that's fine. There's kind of a timeline over here, and you can see some of the different translations that have come over the years and all of that. So from about 1400 BC is when when the originals, we think of like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all those were written. About 1400 years before Jesus, all the way up until about 400 years before Jesus, right? Those were when the originals. Now, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Y'all are going to be too shy to come up here, aren't you? You just want to sit there. All right, I'll pass it around. How about that? Is that better? So this is Hebrew, and you can just take it and pass it around if you want to look at it. This Bible here is a Hebrew Bible, and you're going to notice right off the bat, Hebrew looks very, very different than any language you're familiar with. It's also written backwards. Okay, so the front of this Bible is what you would think of as the back. It's read from right to left. Okay, so Genesis is on what you would think of as the very back. That's Genesis, right? And what it looks like the front is actually going to be like the end of the Old Testament, like Malachi. Although in the Hebrew Bible, the order of the books is different, right? So it's not actually going to be Malachi. It's probably going to be Chronicles, I think. So it's written in Hebrew, and then there's a little bit of Aramaic. Aramaic is a language that's closely related to Hebrew. Looks like Hebrew. In fact, you wouldn't even notice a difference unless you were really trained in these languages. So, all right, now here's the fun part. Hebrew was originally written with no vowels. Okay, so my name, Jason, in Hebrew would be JSN, right? No vowels. You leave all the vowels out, right? And it'd be backwards. So it'd be J would be on the right, and then S, and then N, right? So Hebrew was written right to left and without vowels. Some of the Hebrew manuscripts don't even have spaces between the words, right? And so you look at them, and it just looks like it's one long string of characters. Some of them do have spaces. It's kind of inconsistent. All right? Now, the earliest Greek manuscripts were also written without spaces. They were written in all capital letters. So if you look at this one right here, this is Codex Sinaiticus, and some of these others in here, like Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, you'll see that they're all capital letters. There's no spaces between the words. When it gets to the end of a column, even if it's in the middle of a word, it will just jump down to the next line. Okay, now Greek is at least written from left to right, so you got that much going for you. And it's at least sort of familiar letters. But very, very difficult to read, even for somebody who knows Greek. So you can see some Greek manuscripts here. I'll pass this around too. Tell you what, I'll start this over here. You can look at some of these if you want. Those are some examples of some old Greek manuscripts. I got another one over here somewhere. Where to go? Over here. Here we go. I'll start this here. These are some Greek manuscripts. You can look at some of the Greek manuscripts there. All right, so ancient documents in the Old Testament times were usually written on papyrus or animal skins. This is papyrus. I'm going to pass it around here. You can look at it and feel it. Here you go, John. Pass that around there. So papyrus is made from a reed in the Nile River. And what they would do is they would cut this reed and they'd shave off real thin shavings, and then they'd layer it horizontally and vertically. And then while it was still wet, they'd press it in like a big clamp and press it and dry it, and that makes papyrus here. So this is real papyrus that you're feeling, made in Egypt. That's not old, that's new stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't be passing around if I had real ones. But so some of the ancient manuscripts of Greek are written on papyrus, and some of the Old Testament manuscripts are written on papyrus too. So I'll explain what this is here in a minute. So animal hides is another thing that they would often use, like this giant scroll here on the wall. That's a scroll of Isaiah. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That was written on tanned animal hide, basically leather. Okay, and so it was one giant scroll there. And they would take these papyrus pieces of paper, or they would take animal skins, and they would sew them, or they would glue them together, end to end, edge to edge. You can see the seams in this one here where they're sewn together. And they would just sew that together and make one giant long scroll, and then roll it up. This was an ancient form of bookmaking. This is how they had made their books, right? Shorter documents sometimes in the Old Testament times, they would take maybe like a clay or stone tablet and actually carve it, right? Can you think of a famous example of a stone carved document in the Bible?
I forgot it.
I'll give you a hint. Some of our kids just recited from it a while ago. Ten Commandments, right? So the Ten Commandments were inscribed on stone tablets by God originally, and then Moses had to do it the hard way because he threw a temper tantrum later, right? So that's an example of stone tablets, right? Another way they would do it sometimes is they would take a wood tablet and they would coat it with wax, and then use a stylus to scratch into the wax. That was a lot easier, obviously, than carving out of stone. But you wouldn't use that for documents you wanted to keep a long time, because that would obviously melt in the sun and things like that, right? So if you wanted to keep it for a long time, you'd have to transfer that over onto stone or animal hide or papyrus, right? So another way that sometimes was done is sometimes they would actually use metal, and they would actually etch into metal. So there's a famous example up here, right here, the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. Those are actually two little scrolls made out of silver, and they're etched into silver. And these actually date back to 600 BC. And they have a portion of a verse, or at least something similar to the verse in Numbers, which has like the Aaronic, the blessing of Aaron, where it says, may Yahweh keep you and make his face shine upon you and grant you peace, right? So that's written on this silver scrolls, date back to 600 BC. All right, so this is how they made books and documents back then, right? Now, by the time of the New Testament, papyri, which is the plural papyrus, papyri were being bound together, and they had stopped doing scrolls because this is kind of hard to carry around, right? I mean, you got a long book like Isaiah. This is 24 feet long, right? And I had to hunt forever to find a place that could actually print this stupid thing. Carrying this around would be a bit unwieldy, especially if it's made out of animal skin, right? You wouldn't just be carrying your study Bible to church, right? One scroll would be about as much as you could handle, okay? And so this was a bit unwieldy, and it's hard to put multiple books together, right? Well, around just before the time of Jesus, they invented a new method called the codex. And the codex is what we would call a book, right? They would take papyrus leaves or animals' hides and stack them and then bind them like we have books nowadays, right? And so these large manuscripts here, these are some of the earliest codices that we have. This one is Codex Sinaiticus. There's Codex Vaticanus, which you want to guess where Vaticanus is stored? The Vatican, that's right. It's in the catacombs or the Vatican Library. Sinaiticus, parts of it are, I think the biggest part of it is in England. There's another part somewhere else, I can't remember. You want to guess where Sinaiticus was discovered? Mount Sinai, that's right, at a monastery at Mount Sinai. So that's where it's named from. All right, so then handwritten texts, right? Nowadays, every book that you buy is professionally printed by a printer from a computer, right? But that's not always how it was. In fact, before this document over here, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, this is the Gutenberg Bible, not a real one. I could not afford that. A real page from the Gutenberg Bible would cost you about $100,000. You'd have to take out another mortgage on your house. So this is fake. But the Gutenberg Bible was the very first book that was ever printed on a printing press. Before that, everything before this point had to be handwritten, okay? So can you imagine handwriting The entire book of Isaiah. You takers? Okay, so those handwritten texts are called manuscripts. Man meaning hand, script meaning writing. Manuscripts, handwritten text. Okay? And the originals that Moses or Elijah or whoever wrote, those would be called autographs. Auto meaning self, and graph meaning writing. So autographs were the originals, right? So when we talk about the originals of Scripture, we use the term autographs, okay? All right, any questions so far? All right, I got a question for you. Well, actually, we'll get there in a minute. So, important documents that were going to be passed around and read by a lot of people needed to be copied, right? You wouldn't just want to have one copy of Isaiah because you need it to be read by a lot of people, right? So, they had to be copied. The copying of manuscripts was done by professional scribes. So we read about scribes in the New Testament, right? Jesus gets on their case quite a bit because these guys were experts in the law, right? They spent all day copying manuscripts and studying manuscripts, studying the Bible, right? They were professional Bible writers and copyists. But yet somehow they still missed who Jesus was. So, all right, now here's a question for you. We've got manuscripts, which are the copies, the handwritten copies. And then autographs, which are the originals. Can anyone tell me what library houses the autographs of the Bible?
Library of Congress.
Good guess. That's not it.
Is it the Bible library?
Good guess.
Okay.
Is it London?
Good guess. It's a trick question. None. Because there are no autographs left. Okay? That was a mean question. But here's the point, and this is something that you need to understand, and this is where the challenge comes in, right? We don't have the originals. We don't have the originals that Moses wrote. We don't have the originals that Samuel wrote and that David penned. We don't have those original copies, and to be honest, how would you know that it was David's handwriting anyways, right? So we don't have them. You can imagine papyrus, it's thick, it's tough, it's durable, but most of the documents that we have that have survived in places like Egypt, where it's a very arid climate, because weather's tough on books, right? Some of my books that I ship back and forth to Papua New Guinea, I'd open the box and they'd be moldy already, right? You'll have a chance to look at some of these Bible manuscripts over here, or not manuscripts, but copies over here. That Bible there is from 1580, and you can see how worn it is. There's pages that are missing. There's pages that have been burned and eaten by animals or bugs. Weather's tough on paper, right? And so those autographs have not survived. Now, this raises a question, doesn't it? If we don't have the originals, and we didn't have printers making a bunch of copies back then, and everything was done by hand, how can we be sure that the copies that we have now are what David and Moses and Elijah and all of them wrote? How do we know that they haven't been corrupted, right? And this is one of the big challenges that secular scholars and unbelievers throw at us for the Bible. They say there are hundreds of thousands of differences, right? How do you know that you even have the right Bible? All right, so first off, I'm going to give you two answers, and I don't have time to fully exhaust this tonight, so we'll talk about this more in the future, but one of the reasons that we can have confidence in the accuracy of our Bibles is because we have literally thousands of copies. We don't have a handful of copies, we have thousands of copies, okay? And so up here on the screen, you're going to see, well, maybe you can see if you're close and young, we have a lot of biblical manuscripts surviving. And so the Hebrew Bible, for example, and that includes Hebrew manuscripts as well as Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. We'll talk about that in a minute, called the Septuagint. We've got over 252 Hebrew manuscripts that have survived from all of the different books, okay? And when it comes to Greek translations, we'll talk about this in a minute, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is called the Septuagint. We'll talk about that in a minute. So for the Septuagint, we have over 2,263 surviving manuscripts of the Septuagint. And so what this allows us to do, now some of them are partial little fragments, and some of them are, 24 foot long scroll, right? But what this allows us to do is to compare those documents to see the minor variations, because yes, the fact is, when you hand copy a document, there's going to be minor variations from scribe to scribe. They did a really good job on the whole preserving Scripture, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how good they did. But there are variations, and this is why you have footnotes in your Bible from time to time that say some manuscripts will say blah, 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 right? Because not all the manuscripts are in 100% agreement, okay? But what this allows us to do, because we have so many manuscripts, is to compare them, and we've got several different versions of the book of Isaiah that we can compare. And on the whole, what we find is that the differences between them, by and large, are just spelling errors, or oops, I forgot a word, or when you're copying and you accidentally skip a line and jump down to the next line or something like that. Most of them are very, very minor. They're very easy to figure out because you're looking at two different copies, and one says, we'll get to this in a minute with the KJV, thou shalt commit adultery, and one says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, which do you think the original said? Pretty safe to bet, thou shalt not commit adultery is what was intended, right? God is not commanding us to commit adultery, right? So most of the time, these differences are extremely easy to pick out. There are a handful of cases that are more challenging, and those are the ones that usually get footnotes in your Bible, right? All the other ones are so obvious that they don't even bear mention, right? And so one of the things I love is that our translations, they don't hide this from you. They put the footnote there so that you can see for yourself that, hey, there are some manuscripts that read it this way and some that read it this way, okay? This is pretty, do you have a question? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. All right, so if you're not familiar with ancient documents, the amount of documents that we have for the Old and New Testament is pretty incredible, okay? So for the New Testament, we've got even more, 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament. Almost 6,000 manuscripts. Now, yeah, some of them are that little credit card piece of paper over there that you see in that little frame, right? That's the John Rylands fragment. It's about this big, and it's got portions of a couple verses, right? Others, though, contain the entire Bible, right? And so we've got so many copies and copies and copies that we can compare these manuscripts together. The New Testament is is probably the best attested document in ancient history. You compare this to what we have from other ancient documents. So, for example, anybody ever heard of Homer's Iliad? Story of the Iliad? Yeah? Y'all learn about that in school? Okay. We've got, boy, that's hard to read, isn't it? 650 copies of the Iliad, right? Plato's works. Anybody heard of Plato? Guess how many we got of him? 7. 7 copies of Plato. That's it. From all of ancient history, 7 copies of Plato. The works of Demosthenes, we got about 200 copies of his. The works of Josephus, you've heard me mention him in church before, right? Josephus, one of the most famous historians of the ancient world. Well, a lot of our understanding of ancient Rome comes from him. 55 copies. That's it. 55 copies, right? The Gospel of Thomas, anybody ever heard of that? Right, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Guess how many copies?
4.
4 copies. That's it. 4 portions of copies, right? Like, that's it. Now, if that's all we had of the New Testament, you can imagine it'd be a little difficult at places to put it together. We've got 5,800. 5,800. Okay? So, piecing together what the original said is not that difficult. Well, it is, but it's because you and I don't know Greek that well. But for somebody who knows Greek, it's not that hard, okay? And then the tragedies of Euripides, 330, right? So when you compare what we have of the Bible to ancient manuscripts, it blows it out of the water. We've got copies out the wazoo, so many we don't know what to do with. We're still going through copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls and getting those documented and everything that were discovered like 70 years ago. That's how much we've got. All right. Hold on here. Oh, sorry. So Hebrew scribes. The other thing is we can have confidence in the accuracy of our Bibles because most scribes were extremely careful in their work. Now there were some sloppy ones out there, okay? But most of them were extremely careful, okay? Hebrew scribes, they would actually count the number of words and sometimes letters in the entire book. They knew how many words were in Isaiah. And when they were done, they would go back and they would count the number of words to make sure it matched. And if it didn't, they'd scrap it and start over, right? They would count the number of words. They would put notes in the margins to make sure that things were copied correctly. They would give instructions to later scribes on how to translate and copy certain things. So some of the most famous scribes were called the Masoretes. Anybody ever heard of the Masoretes? Okay. The Masoretes were a group of Jewish scribes that lived around 500 to 1000 AD. Okay. And they were known for being extremely meticulous in their copying. All right. Every copy had to be checked for accuracy. They would discard it if it had too many mistakes. And they preserved the pronunciation. So I told you earlier that there was no vowels written, right? Well, that'd be kind of difficult to read 2,000 years later, right? And so if you'll notice, when you look at these Hebrew Bibles, you see the dots and lines above and below the letters. Those are vowels. And so the Masoretes, they were trained, they knew how to pronounce it correctly, and they went back and they added in those vowels, vowel pointing is what it's called, to help us now to understand how to pronounce it, how to read it. And I know that it makes it a lot easier, doesn't it? With all those dots in there. It's a pain in the rear to learn, but that does help, right? And so, well, we'll come back to that here in a minute. So, all right, so let's talk about the most important manuscripts real quick. So, one of the most important ones is called the Aleppo Codex. Where did that go? Here, right here. And the Aleppo Codex was done by the Masoretes here, and around the year 925 AD, in the 900s AD. Okay, and there's another one called the Leningrad Codex. These are named after where they were found. That was done about 100 years later, 1008 BC. Both of these are in Hebrew. They're both Masoretic texts, so they were copied by the Masoretes. The Aleppo Codex was the older one, and it did contain the entire Hebrew Old Testament, but unfortunately a fire burned about 25% of it. And so we've got about 75% of the Old Testament contained in the Aleppo Codex. So, because it wasn't quite complete, the modern Hebrew Bible, which is this right here, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, that's a mouthful, BHS, we'll just call it BHS. BHS is the standard for most of our modern Bibles. This is what our English Bibles are translated from in the Old Testament. And it's done mostly from the Leningrad Codex, okay? We'll talk about why that is here in a minute. So the Leningrad Codex is the foundation of the BHS. It was done about 1008 AD. It has the entire Old Testament in it. Now, scholars can look at that document and compare it with others, and what they've found is the Masoretes were extremely meticulous scribes. You can't tell looking at it that it wasn't printed on a printer. It looks like it was. And you'll have a chance to come up and look at these if you want, and you can look for yourself and see how, like, the lines are perfectly straight, the margins are perfectly straight. It's just a work of art. All right, so that's one of the oldest ones that we have. Up until 1947, this was the oldest Hebrew manuscript that we had, was these two. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, if we go back a little further, we go to the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate was translated by Jerome in the year 382. Okay, 382. So by this point, Latin was the language of the Roman Empire, and you can already see that in the New Testament, right? When Jesus was crucified, the title above his head, what language was it written in? Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, I believe, were the three languages. And so Latin was already starting to gain popularity. By 382, it was officially, fully the language. People didn't use Aramaic or Greek anymore. Latin was the language. So Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in 382 AD. Okay, and this, I've got a manuscript here that you can look at. This is actually, it's not from a Bible book per se, it's from an apocryphal book. We'll talk about that later, called the Book of Maccabees, first book of the Maccabees. And this is a handwritten, you can't tell it looking at it, but it is a handwritten manuscript on animal skin called vellum. Okay, this was done in around the year 1250. AD. So this is about almost 800 years old, and it is handwritten. So if you touch it, you can pick it up and look at it. Just don't take it out of the thing, so because it's quite old. So this is a Latin Vulgate manuscript. It's in Latin, and you can look at it and see all the fancy little penmanship that the guy did when he was doing this. It's kind of crazy to think about that this piece of paper was written before Columbus discovered America. 200 years before it, right? When this was written, the Crusades were going on, right? So that's the Latin Vulgate was the translation that people used for about 1,000 years. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So this was the standard all the way up until the Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to here shortly, all right? We go back a little further, though, and we've got the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, I mentioned this already, the Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, all right? So in about 250 or so BC, by that point, remember the Israelites had gone into captivity, right? Where did they go into captivity? Anybody remember?
Egypt.
Babylon, yeah, Babylon for the southern tribe of Judah, and for the northern tribe of Israel, they went to where?
Assyria.
Assyria, very good. So the northern tribe went into Assyria, the southern tribe went into to Babylon. Okay, so over the years of influence from all these foreign nations, they stopped using Hebrew. They switched over, started using Aramaic, and eventually Greek became the language of the day, right? From the invasion of, what's his name? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great brought the Greek influence and culture in, and Greek took off. So by the time that Jesus was born, most Israelites did not speak Hebrew, at least not regularly. They would speak Aramaic or even Greek. Okay, so by the time of 250 BC, they needed a Greek translation of their Hebrew Old Testament. They couldn't read it anymore. And so they did a translation called the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint from the Greek number for 70, Septuaginta, because there were 70 translators that worked on the Septuagint. And the legend goes that they all went and they all translated separately, and when they came back together, lo and behold, they had perfect translation. Every single one of them, their translations matched perfectly. I might question that story a little bit, but anyhow, translations don't have to be perfect. That's okay. But that's where they get the name Septuagint from. And it's often abbreviated with the symbols LXX. L for 50, 10, 10. So 50 plus 10 plus 10 is 70, right? So that's where the LXX comes from. Whenever you see the Septuagint reference, oftentimes it'll be referenced with that. So this was done from around the year 250 to 150 BC, somewhere in that time frame is when the Septuagint was done. And we've got manuscripts left over from the Septuagint that date back to the early first centuries and things like that. And so those are some of our oldest manuscripts. Now, the problem is that the Septuagint, and by the way, the Septuagint probably would have been the Bible that Jesus most had access to. In fact, if you look in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, sometimes when it quotes the Old Testament, the reason it sounds a little different than the Old Testament does is because a lot of times the New Testament writers were quoting the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. Okay, and that's why you'll see variations sometimes when you read a New Testament quote of the Old Testament, and you go back and you look at the Old Testament verse, and it's a little different. Sometimes the reason is because they're quoting the Septuagint. Okay. Some of the oldest copies of the Septuagint were amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll talk about those here in just a second. All right, so let's go to what we call the great unseal of codices, okay? Unseal, big fancy word. There's a lot of big fancy words in this stuff, okay? Unsealed just means all caps, all right? So these manuscripts were in all capital letters, and I told you earlier they had no spaces between the words, and they break middle of a word, and it'll jump down to the next line. So there's 5 of these, and they are Codex Sinaiticus, which is probably, this one and Codex Vaticanus are the 2 most important ones. So Sinaiticus, then you got Alexandrinus, discovered in Alexandria. And then you've got Vaticanus, which is currently housed in the Vatican. And then you've got Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Now this one's an interesting one. The reason that it's called Rescriptus is because it was re-scripted. What they did is, it was originally a Bible manuscript, and it was, or I've got this backwards, I always get it mixed up. They could actually erase the ink and write on the same document again, and that would be a rescript, right? And so the reason this one's so hard to read and so yucky looking is because that's what they did. And so it's kind of hard to read it, but the Bible's on there. So that's Ephraemi Rescriptus, and then there's Codex Bezae, which is the other one. These are the 5 great unsealed codices, and so at least 2 of them, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, have like the entire Bible in them. So these are extremely important manuscripts, and these are from around 300 to 400 AD. Okay, so these are extremely old, and they're extremely close to the New Testament. So these are some of the most important New Testament and Old Testament manuscripts. The problem is these are in Greek, right? The Old Testament's in Greek too. So far, if you've been paying attention, what is the oldest Hebrew Old Testament manuscript that we've talked about so far? The oldest Hebrew manuscript. What's that?
Aramaic.
No, Aramaic is a language similar to Hebrew. Okay? We actually have to go all the way up here to the Masoretic text, where is it here? The Aleppo and the Leningrad Codex. Those were until 1947, and these are both from around 900 to 1000 AD. All right? So, when was the last Old Testament book written?
1,000 years ago.
More than that. When was the last Old Testament book written? About 400 AD, or 400 BC, sorry. So 400 years before Jesus, up until 1947, the oldest Hebrew manuscript we had was, well, I guess the Aleppo Codex from 900-something AD. Right? That is 1,500 years after the last Hebrew book was written. A lot can happen in 1,500 years, can't it? Especially when you're hand copying manuscripts. So how do we know that this is any good? How do we know that it preserved the original? Well, fun thing happened in 1947, okay? This is 2 years after the close of World War II. Nobody's paying attention to what's going on in Israel. They're all worried about what's going on in Germany and Russia, right? But a shepherd boy was walking through the Judean hill country in an area called Qumran, and he was bored, I guess, and he picked up a rock and he threw it in a cave, and he heard what sounded like glass breaking. And so he gets curious, and he walks into this cave to snoop it out and see what's in there. He finds some broken pottery. And in and amongst this broken pottery, he finds some ancient manuscripts. The kid doesn't have a clue what he's just stumbled on, right? But he takes it to somebody, and they take it to somebody, and eventually people figure out these aren't just any manuscripts. These are 2,000-year-old manuscripts, right? And they're Bible manuscripts. And so then all the archaeologists descend like a horde, and you can imagine something like Indiana Jones transpiring, right? And they dig up, they find not just one cave, but several caves. And they begin digging through these caves, and they find more and more and more. And what was in those caves is what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? So the Dead Sea Scrolls, I forgot to include that. We'll come back to that. Well, hold on. Let me get ahead of myself here. I got ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Let me rewind a little bit. One thing I want to tell you about real quick on Codex Vaticanus. We were talking about how accurately the scribes copy these things. Not all scribes were as meticulous, right? And so there is a page in Codex Vaticanus, you get to Hebrews chapter 11, where a scribe at some point had gone through and had darkened all the lines and helped to kind of make the text easier to read. The problem is, as he was doing so, he felt free to correct the manuscript in a few places, right? And so a later scribe comes and he's looking at Codex Vaticanus and he sees this place where the previous scribe has corrected the reading. And so he then, in the margin, writes, I think one of the best slams for ancient nerdy stuff ever. He writes in the margin, he says, "Fool and knave, leave the old reading, do not change it." Right? And so he called out the previous scribe and then corrected it back to what it was supposed to read and kept on going, right? So there was a lot of effort made to make sure that these documents were preserved. And so even, I think that's especially kind of funny. Where was I? Okay, sorry, I got out of order here. All right, before we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we'll come back to that. Some of the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, let's talk about those for a minute. So this is some of the oldest Bibles that we've got here, these unsealed codices, but if you go back before that, we do have fragments and smaller manuscripts. And so there's a few. P45 has the entire, or most of the Gospels and Acts, and P46, the P means papyrus. So Papyrus 46 has most of the Pauline epistles and Hebrews and dates to the 3rd century, that'd be the 200s AD. And then P52 is this little guy right here. This is the John Rylands fragment, or P52. It contains a portion of John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33, where Pilate tells the Jews, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. The Jews said it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And then on the back side, it's got verses 37 and 38, where Pilate says, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answers, "So you say that I am a king? And for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who hears the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said, "What is truth?" One of my favorite lines from the crucifixion scene, and that's on this little piece here. It doesn't contain all the words, but it's very obviously that's what it's from. And so this actually dates to the earliest part of the 2nd century. So we're talking about maybe the first 20 years, 100 to 120 AD. John, who wrote this, died, we think, around 95 AD. So this was written barely like 10 to 20 years after John, the author, died. What that means is that when this copy was made, the original would have still been around, right? The original would have still been around probably for the next 200 years. In fact, all the way up through these unsealed codices, they probably still had the originals even as late as that, right? So some of the earliest manuscripts that we've got date all the way to within 20 years of the original author, and would have been around during the same time, would have overlapped with the autographs. Okay, so this is P52, not the real P52. Obviously, that's in a museum in Britain. This is just a worthless fake. So, not worthless, it's worth something to me, but it's a fake. So, where was I here? Let's see here. All right, so Dead Sea Scroll. Let's go back to that. Actually, let's one more thing. So we have at least 8 manuscript fragments that date to the 2nd century. And for the 3rd century, we've got at least 64. And so we're talking about the Gospels and Acts and Revelation, and a bunch of different books, included all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. We're talking 100 to 200 and 300 AD, right? We've got quite a few manuscripts that are really, really early. Now, the Old Testament. So up until 1947, the oldest manuscript we had of Hebrew was right here, the Aleppo Codex from like 900 AD. But when that little shepherd kid threw a rock in the cave, he discovered manuscripts that dated all the way back to 200 BC. Okay, so when he broke that jar in the cave, he pushed the manuscript evidence all the way back to 200 years before Jesus. And this scroll that you see on the wall here, this is the Great Scroll of Isaiah. We'll talk about it in a minute, right? And so this is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important, right? He literally pushed the date of the earliest manuscript in Hebrew back over 1,000 years, okay? Just cut out on me. Yep. Battery may have died on me. All right, I'll just have to talk loud. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these date to around 200 to 100 AD, 200 BC to 100 AD, okay? And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've got the entire Old Testament, except for the book of Esther. That's the only book that isn't in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there's also numerous other Jewish writings of that era. Okay, so this pushed back our manuscript evidence for the Old Testament by over 1,000 years. And then it's got a bunch of non-biblical documents in there too. So the Qumran was a community of a bunch of Jewish people called Essenes, and they had a library there, right? And so what we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls was essentially a library. So it had tons of different kinds of books. It had biblical books, but it also had books, like one that's called the Manual of Discipline, which describes how the community was supposed to function. It had books like a hymn scroll that had collections of psalms and hymns, like a songbook, right? There were other books like an apocalyptic book that described something like the Battle of Armageddon, but their own unique twist to it. So the group that lived here at this community was not a mainstream Jewish group. They were kind of an offshoot called the Essenes. They believed, probably rightly, that the temple was corrupted. They detached themselves from the temple. They were looking forward to a Messiah to come and make the temple pure again, because they believed that the temple had been corrupted, and well, that's probably true. So it had a bunch of other books. It had over 900 documents were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. About 200 and something of those are biblical documents, and the remaining 700 are all kinds of other documents, right? So in the community rules, it had some interesting things. Waving at someone with your left hand could result in 10 days of punishment. Spitting or snorting at something that wasn't supposed to be humorous would get you 30 days of penance. And mooning your neighbor merited a 1-month timeout. So don't moon your neighbor. So the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us a lot about Jewish practices at the time. They also give us tons of biblical documents. So one of the biggest, the most important ones that was in there was this Great Scroll of Isaiah. And it's 24 feet long. It contains all 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, start to finish. Now remember, Hebrew, which side do you start on? This is the beginning, right? So that's the beginning of Isaiah, and that's the end down there. And so this dates to around 200 to 150 BC. So this scroll was written 200-something years before Jesus, right? This is one of the most famous. This is the real one, I believe, is on display in Jerusalem at a museum there. And so scholars immediately, you can imagine how excited they were to look this over. And one of the first things they do is they compare this with these Masoretic texts that are, some 12 to 1500 years later. And guess what? They're almost identical. They are so close, even, that they're not exactly, right? There are some variations here and there. But they were so close, the Dead Sea Scrolls were so similar to the Masoretic text that came 1500 years later, that some scholars even basically said that the Dead Sea Scrolls provided no new information about the text of the Bible. That's pretty astounding. We're talking about a document that was written and copied 1500 years later. And for most of history, we had no idea whether that was exactly like the original or not. But then in 1947, we discovered these documents dating back 1,000, 1,500 years before. And guess what? They're so similar that it's almost like, okay, well, no big deal. In fact, they are so similar that even to this day, most modern translations still rely on the Leningrad Codex as their base for the Old Testament. The ESV, which is my preferred translation that I use most, departs from the Masoretic text in approximately 18 spots in the entire Old Testament. That's how accurate the Masoretic text is when compared with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right? 1,500 years, and basically not much has changed. Okay? Yes?
So what did the
Masoretes, yeah.
what did they use in transcribing?
So it was all, you mean like what was their original? Or how did they do it?
Where did they, they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. What documents did they use to?
That's a good question. So there were documents between here and there, right? There were other Old Testament manuscripts. We just don't have them now. So presumably what they copied was scrolls that were from 500 AD or 600 AD or whatever, maybe back to 200 AD. We don't know. We don't have those now, but obviously they had them then. And what this demonstrates is that between whatever they copied here, all the way back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, 200 BC, there's continuity. Like, they're copying very reliably, even over the span of 1,000 years. Right? Any other questions on that? Okay. So the ESV, it basically, so even to this day, the BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, this is essentially the Leningrad Codex. Okay? This is still what Bible translators use today. This is still the basis for most new translations because it's good. Even when you compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it holds up. So I think that's a testament to how accurately the manuscripts have been copied over the years. All right. Another thing this did for us. Okay. Some critical scholars. There are a lot of. I don't think there's any field of ancient study where scholars hate the thing they study more than the Bible. Okay. So you'll find biblical scholars who hate the Bible and spend their life trying to debunk it, basically. And one of the claims that had been made up until 1947 was that Isaiah was actually 3 different authors and had been pieced together maybe as late as 100 AD or 100 BC, I think it was. And that the final form of the book of Isaiah didn't happen until around 100 BC. Okay, they, of course, traditional scholars had argued that Isaiah was written by Isaiah in like 600 to 700 BC, right? But some critical scholars said, no, it probably wasn't written by him. It was probably written by 3 different people and put together around 100 BC. Well, when you find a scroll that's 24 feet long, has the entire book in it, and it dates to 100 years before that, that kind of doesn't hold water anymore, right? And so this demonstrated that the book of Isaiah had remained in its current form since at least 200 years before Jesus. And this included passages like Isaiah 53 that prophesied of a suffering servant that would be pierced in his hands and feet and that would bear the sins for the people, right? This is a passage that's so obviously about Jesus, and yet we have proof it was written more than 200 years before him, right? So this was a pretty substantial find. Now there are some places where the Dead Sea Scrolls do differ from the Masoretic text, not a whole lot, but where it does, modern Bible scholars have implemented that into translations and made them better. So it's helped us out a lot in the long run. All right, we're going to have to kind of fly through the translation history here. So Latin Vulgate was the Bible translation up until Protestant Reformations. Now, around in 1455, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg enabled books to be mass printed. And so this is a copy of a page from the Gutenberg Bible. This is the very first book ever printed by a printing press. It's the Gutenberg Bible. And it's a Latin Bible, so you're not going to be able to read it, but you can come look at it because it's kind of pretty. All right? After that, things really sped up as far as Bible translation goes. So the printing press made it possible to mass distribute books, right? And so in 1517, Martin Luther kicked off the Reformation, and he shortly after, well, I'll skip over to John Wycliffe. All right, let's go back a little bit. John Wycliffe was the first person to translate the Bible into English, the full Bible, and it was in Middle English around the 1380s. Okay, there had been a couple that had translated scripture portions. Those are here. I'll let you look at them if you want. It's kind of interesting trying to read them because how many of y'all seen How to Train Your Dragon? Right, the runes on that is Anglo-Saxon. That's what the very first English Bible translations look like. Right, so fun fact for you. All right, come to 1526. This is the first so-called modern English Bible translation. This is William Tyndale. William Tyndale translated the New Testament into English. Read it for me. So it is modern English, but it does not look like modern English, right? It is extremely difficult. So you'll notice here, so this is, he called them together, right? So I'll let you pass it around. This is a Tyndale New Testament, a copy of one. So this year is the 500th anniversary of the Tyndale New Testament, okay? 500 years this year. Tyndale translated the Bible illegally into English, and he was executed. He was burned at the stake because he translated the Bible into English in the year 1536, I believe. He paid the ultimate price for that, to get that book, right? There's Martin Luther translated the Bible into German in 1522. There's a copy of a page of his translation right here, if you can read German. Tyndale was not able to finish the whole Bible. He did the New Testament, he did portions of the Old Testament, and a friend of his named John Rogers finished the job and translated the rest of the Bible into English. But it was illegal, right? And his buddy just got killed for it, so he did not put his name on it. He did not say John Rogers Bible. He put a pseudonym and called himself Thomas Matthew. And so this is called the Matthews Bible. But it is really Tyndale's New Testament plus John Rogers' help finishing it up. So take a look at it, see if you can read anything out of it. It's quite challenging. There's actually there's printing errors in it. There's typos in that Bible that you can find. I've got a page from the second printing of the Matthews Bible. This was done in 1549. This one is real. You can take a look at it if you want. I'm going to leave it up here, though. I'm going to pass it around. And then in 1540, there was another one done called the Great Bible. And so the Great Bible was the very first authorized Bible. Okay, the Great Bible was the first one that was authorized or legal. Okay, so John, or Tyndale, when he was dying, his famous last words, he prayed, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England," and then he was burned at the stake. Right. A few years later, God did, and the King of England authorized the translation of an English Bible. That was a great Bible. Okay, so that was the first one that was legal. I'm going to have to skip through this. You're going to miss some blanks. I'm sorry, but I don't want to keep it forever. One of the things that you will notice if you come look at these is that there are no verse numbers on anything before 1551. Okay, because before 1551 there were no verse numbers. Right? So if you look at this, there's no verse numbers on there. But in 1551, a guy named Erasmus published a New Testament that was a parallel Bible. It had the Latin Vulgate on one side, it had the Greek in the middle, and it had his own Latin translation on the right. And it was an attempt to show how bad the Latin translation was. He put the real Greek in the middle, and then his own translation to kind of show Latin Vulgate's not a good translation. You should probably not use it. And so in order to make it easier to compare lines, the printer added verse numbers to this Bible. So this Bible page right here is from 1551. This is the very first Bible ever printed that had verse numbers from 1551. Okay. Right after that, there was a Bible translation done called the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible was done in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, by Protestants like John Calvin and Theodore Beza and a bunch of other guys, John Knox. They worked together on this, and they translated the Bible into English, and they included the verse numbers from Erasmus's New Testament. So this is the very first English Bible that has verse numbers. It's also the very first study Bible. So it has tons of notes in the margins, and it's got pictures and like little drawings and stuff in it. Okay, so this is the Geneva Bible. This was the most popular Bible for Protestants up until the KJV made it illegal. Okay, this was the Bible that the Pilgrims would have brought over on the Mayflower. This would have been the first English Bible in America. Okay, so this is the Geneva Bible. It's got tons of study notes. The study notes were not very sympathetic to the Pope, and so Catholics and Anglicans really did not like it. This is an actual Geneva Bible. I'm not going to pass it around, but you are welcome to come up and look at it. This was printed in 1580. So the Geneva Bible was done in 1560. This particular copy was about 20 years later. It's got writing in the back from some guy named John Andrews. He's writing in it and putting dates. John Andrews, his book, 1700 something. So this is from 200 years before America became a country. So it's almost 500 years old. So you are welcome to look at it. You can thumb through it and everything. Just leave your drink at the table, please. So that's the Geneva Bible. After the Geneva Bible came the Bishop's Bible. I mentioned that the Geneva Bible was not very friendly to the Pope. It had they called the Pope the Antichrist and lots of other things like that. And so Anglicans and Catholics didn't really like that much, so they had to come up with their own version. So the Anglicans created the Bishop's Bible. This was a pulpit-sized Bible. You can see how big that would be. I can read that all the way back there, can't you? So it was a pulpit-sized Bible, and it was done by the Anglican Church, by the Church of England. Okay, so this is from 1568. After that, there was a Catholic Bible that came out. The New Testament came out in 1582. The New Testament came out in 1610. It's called the Douay-Rheims translation. I don't have a link from it yet. And that translation was a Catholic Bible that translated the Latin Vulgate into English. It didn't go back to Hebrew and Greek. It went to the Latin Vulgate. Right? So in Matthew, in the Catholic Bible here, the Douay-Rheims, it said, "Give us this day our transubstantiated bread." Because Catholics believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is that when you take the Lord's Supper, the body and the blood of Christ are actually transformed
into the actual physical body and blood of Christ. You are actually drinking blood. You are actually eating flesh when you take communion. Catholics still hold this today. It's called transubstantiation. And so they kind of read that back into Scripture, and they translated it, give us this day our transubstantiated bread. And then when Jesus comes preaching a gospel of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, in the Catholic version it says he came preaching a gospel of penance and the forgiveness of sins. So do penance, which again hits at some of the Catholic doctrines. So Catholics have their own version. And then good old 1611. What came around in 1611? King James, yep. So how many of you guys have a 1611 KJV? Anybody? Your KJV says 1611 on it? I would invite you to compare. Okay, so a lot of them nowadays will say 1611 KJV. You will find, this is a fake, so you can pass it around and look at it. This is what the 1611 KJV actually looked like. You will find it a little challenging to read. Some of the letters are different. They use a V instead of U. Where we use a U, they use a V. There's an S that looked like an F. So when you see the Gospels, it almost looks like gospel. Looks like it's got an F in there, gospel, but it's not an F, it's an S. So I'll pass it around and let you look at it. You see 1611 KJV. And then this is an actual leaf from a pulpit Bible that was printed in 1611. This is a KJV. So here, can you read that, Joe? What does it say? Yeah. So it looks like wrath judgment, but it's rash judgment, because that funny thing that looks like an F is actually an S, and instead of a J, it's an I. So the 1611 KJV looks a little different than your KJV does now. But don't take a look. The KJV went through several revisions. I'm not gonna give you all the details on those. The one that you have now is based upon this one here. This is the 1769 revision done by Oxford. And so from 1769 onwards, this has the spellings that are at least closer to what you're used to in your Bible. Although this one is funny, yes. This is the Shepherd's Bible. And then, there's some things you can look at. So, that is it. A lot more we can talk about, but we'll stop there. Any questions? A lot of information.
Is this your personal collection?
Yes.
How long have you been collecting?
Ever since I found out it was possible. So when I was in seminary and I started learning about some of the Protestant Reformation history and everything, I got interested in it. And one day I just happened to stumble on a website where you could buy Bible leaves. And something like that framed one down there, I got it for like $10. So that's a 16 up to 1640. It's no later than 1640. And so I found out you could buy Bible leaves online, some of them for fairly cheap. And so I was like, well, that's cool. Gotta have that. So I started buying them, and then I found, oh wait, you can buy like all kinds of stuff. So I just kind of went down the rabbit hole. So, yeah. The one that I started buying from originally is called greatsite.com, kind of a weird name. That they don't sell Bible leaves anymore though. But if you just Google Bible leaves, like you can find them on eBay, so all over the place. Some of them, like that one, are really cheap, and some are not. And then ones like this replica here of the Matthew's Bible, you can find. You'll never believe where I bought this. You want to guess?
Goodwill.
Papua New Guinea. I bought this in Papua New Guinea. It was at a Christian bookstore in Papua New Guinea. And I couldn't believe it. But anyhow, you can find them all over the place, so they're pretty easy to find. Any other questions? You were there when I bought it. You don't remember? We were in Kanansu. You didn't care at the time. All right. Look at stuff if you want. I'll stick around. You can ask questions if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.